A young girl walking home from school found a small pile of Polaroid photos lying in the gutter. There were 20 in all, neatly wrapped in a rubber band. She picked them up, and as she walked, she started to browse. The first photo was that of a ghostly white man on a black background, standing just far enough away from the camera that she couldn't make out his features. The girl slid the photo to the back of the stack and looked at the next one. The photo was that of the same man, now standing a bit closer. The girl flipped through the next several photos quickly. With each one, the man in the picture came a bit closer, and his features were a bit clearer. Turning the last corner to her house, the girl noticed that the man in the photo seemed to be looking at her, even when she moved the stack from side to side. It frightened her, but she kept flipping them over, one by one. By the 19th picture, the man was so close his face was completely filling the frame. His expression was the most horrifying the girl had ever seen. Walking up the driveway, she turned to the last photo. This time, instead of an image, there were 2 words. Close enough. Hearing a scream outside their house, the girl's brother rushed to the door and opened it. All he saw was a pile of photographs lying on the doorstep. The top one looked like an extremely pale version of his sister, but she was standing too far back for him to be sure. Does anyone remember an old PC game from the early 1990s called Mr. Mix? It's mainly a typing game, similar to Mario Teaches Typing, where you have to type words into a box to make a chef, the titular Mr. Mix, put ingredients into a bowl. Unlike most typing games, however, this game is notorious for having an insane difficulty curve. The game has a words per minute requirement for each level, being as low as 10 on level 1 and as high as 85 on the 3rd. By level 5, the requirement reaches over 500, effectively making it impossible to proceed any further. One of the main things that people noticed about this game immediately was the background music. The music on the first level was an unsettling pattern of growls that got progressively louder as the level went on, often causing damage to early computer speakers that were not designed to handle extremely high volumes of sound. The second level had no music at all, and the third had what sounded like an extremely low-quality recording of a hairdryer playing in the background. The remaining 2 levels had an extremely loud high-pitched ringing throughout the level that caused severe eardrum damage to those who managed to get that far. Another rather disturbing aspect of the game was the design of Mr. Mix himself. He was a large, round-faced, overweight man with large, beady eyes and red spots on his cheeks. Most children who played the game reported having vivid nightmares of Mr. Mix speaking to them in a quiet, raspy voice and threatening them to keep quiet about something. However, none of them could remember exactly what that was. One psychologist who saw many of these children reported being disturbed by the sheer amount of terror on the faces of the children as they recounted the details of the nightmare. Many of the children broke down in tears in the process, begging for their parents to save them. However, no direct relationship to the game itself could be determined by these few cases, as not all children suffered the same adverse effects. For obvious reasons, the game did not sell very well. It remained in relative obscurity until a few years ago, when PC hackers got a hold of a ROM of the game and started digging through it. Using memory hacking software, they managed to crack the game's code and bypass the impossible 5th level. What they found, however, was extremely disturbing and caused many of them to quit the expedition altogether. According to the reports these hackers left behind, the game behaves very strangely if the 5th level is bypassed. The game crashes violently and closes, writing a bunch of files to the user's System32 directory to the point that the RAM was almost completely filled. These files are reportedly pictures of people with horribly deformed faces, appearing to scream in pain and agony with their eyes appearing to be bleeding from their tear ducts and their outer layer of skin torn clean off in multiple places. If the user attempts to delete these files, the computer will violently crash and blue screen, causing permanent, irreparable damage to the user's hard drive. The hackers found that this was caused by a lone byte in the game's ROM that triggered when the 5th level was completed. After removing this bite, they were able to proceed to the 6th and final level. Unfortunately, all the original hackers declined to discuss what they saw in the final level. All of them became extremely paranoid and reclusive, refusing to talk about anything related to the game, and showing astonishingly extreme symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. Most of them ceased to be able to form coherent sentences within a week, and within a month, all of them went missing. All remaining copies of the game were destroyed. To this day, no one knows what was in that game that caused them so much psychological damage. Maybe it's better that way. 2 years after this incident, a man was arrested after trying to kidnap an 8-year-old girl from a grocery store. Through DNA and fingerprint analysis, the man was identified as one of the original hackers who viewed the final level of the game. He was wearing a white chef's hat and had a look of unspeakable malice and insanity on his face. When interrogated, the man would only say one thing: "I'm Mr. Mix." Shh. Fingers trembling with excitement, I opened the package. Just as I had hoped, it was the camera I won on eBay. With mild delight, I realized I had received a better deal than I had planned, because the previous owner had left the memory card in the slot. Before sending an email to the seller alerting them of the mistake, I decided to see if anything was on it. Setting the camera on slideshow, I watched as the camera displayed a picture of a shipping label. My confusion turned to horror, as the next image was of a person brutally murdered. The rest of the card was alternating pictures of a mailing address, followed by a murder scene. The last image was of the shipping label from the box I had just opened. In 1983, a team of deeply pious scientists conducted a radical experiment in an undisclosed facility. The scientists had theorized that a human without access to any senses or ways to perceive stimuli would be able to perceive the presence of God. They believed that the 5 senses clouded our awareness of eternity, and without them, a human could actually establish contact with God by thought. An elderly man who claimed to have nothing left to live for was the only test subject to volunteer. To purge him of all his senses, the scientists performed a complex operation in which every sensory nerve connection to his brain was surgically severed. Although the test subject retained full muscular function, he could not see, hear, taste, smell, or feel. With no possible way to communicate with or even sense the outside world, he was alone with his thoughts. Scientists monitored him as he spoke aloud about his state of mind in jumbled, slurred sentences that he couldn't even hear. After 4 days, the man claimed to be hearing hushed, unintelligible voices in his head. Assuming it was an onset of psychosis, the scientists paid little attention to the man's concerns. 2 days later, the man cried that he could hear his dead wife speaking with him, and even more, he could communicate back. The scientists were intrigued, but were not convinced until the subject started naming dead relatives of the scientists. He repeated personal information to the scientists that only their dead spouses and parents would have known. At this point, a sizable portion of scientists left the study. After a week of conversing with the deceased through his thoughts, the subject became distressed, saying the voices were overwhelming. In every waking moment, his consciousness was bombarded by hundreds of voices that refused to leave him alone. He frequently threw himself against the wall, trying to elicit a pain response. He begged the scientists for sedatives so he could escape the voices by sleeping. This tactic worked for 3 days, until he started having severe night terrors. The subject repeatedly said that he could see and hear the deceased in his dreams. Only a day later, the subject began to scream and clawed his non-functional eyes, hoping to sense something in the physical world. The hysterical subject now said the voices of the dead were deafening and hostile, speaking of hell and the end of the world. At one point, he yelled "No heaven, no forgiveness" for 5 hours straight. He continually begged to be killed, but the scientists were convinced that he was close to establishing contact with God. After another day, the subject could no longer form coherent sentences. Seemingly mad, he started to bite off chunks of flesh from his arm. The scientists rushed into the test chamber and restrained him to a table so he couldn't kill himself. After a few hours of being tied down, the subject halted his struggling and screaming. He stared blankly at the ceiling as teardrops silently streaked across his face. For 2 weeks, the subject had to be manually rehydrated due to the constant crying. Eventually, he turned his head, and despite his blindness, made focused eye contact with the scientist for the first time in the study. He whispered, "I've spoken with God, and He has abandoned us." And his vital signs stopped. There was no apparent cause of death. Follow-up study, 2000. Dr. GF, Department of Neurology, hospital name withheld, San Francisco, California. Recent study of degenerative disease which targets the motor function and cognitive decline often leads to hallucinations of the deceased. The death of targeted cells and chemicals in the brain by this disease leads to a loss of smell, among other senses. The cause of the disease is unknown. Hallucinations present in 39.8% of the patients, falling into 3 categories: a sensation of presence, person, a sideways passage, commonly of an animal, or illusions. Present 25.5% of patients, an isolated occurrence in 14.3%, formed visual hallucinations present in 22.2%, isolated in 9.3%, and auditory hallucinations present in 9.7%, isolated in 2.3%. Continuing study in San Francisco, California, 2003 through present. It was approximately 12:15 when I entered the Johnson County Community Health Clinic. I was there for an appointment I had set up weeks ago, just a routine checkup. It wasn't a new place for me. I had been there a couple times before. However, the place had an odd, nostalgic feel to it, as if it were a location from my childhood or something, and I could never pinpoint exactly what this feeling was or where it came from. And as I walked in, an overwhelming feeling of déjà vu swept over me. The hum of the flickering fluorescent lights, the white tile flooring, the muted beige paint that colored the walls. I noticed that there was a TV mounted in the corner, a smaller flat screen that was playing a short PowerPoint slideshow on a loop of ads and events that were being held by the clinic. I passed the empty waiting area, a small area of the main room with magazines, children's playthings, and blue cushioned chairs, and approached the woman at the front desk. She was sitting in her bluish-gray office chair, looking at a spreadsheet on the same Windows XP desktop they've had since 2008. There was a sign-in sheet at the counter in front of me. "I have an appointment with Dr. Pebbins?" I asked. "What time?" 12:30, I replied. She began typing something into her keyboard. "Ah, yes," she responded. "Gary Johnston?" "Mm-hmm. Yes, I'll tell the doctor. Please fill this out." She handed me a clipboard, which held a simple fill-out form. I walked back to the waiting area, took a seat, and began to fill out the form. I was about halfway done with filling in my information when I slumped back in my chair. I hadn't gotten much sleep the night prior, and I was exhausted. As I slumped back, I noticed something very peculiar. My head never hit the wall. In fact, it felt like it went in. I got up quite frightened and looked at the wall. Nothing. Not a single hole or dent had been made in the wall by my head. So I reached to touch it, and my fingers went through it. I recoiled in shock. What the hell was that? I thought as I reached to touch the wall again, only to find my fingers clipped through once more. Then suddenly I lost my balance, tripped and fell directly through the wall. I fell face first onto some dirty tan carpeting. Upon getting back up, I realized that I was in a completely different room. Well, not really a room per se, more so a set of rooms, all of which connected by openings. The walls were covered in gross tan pattern wallpaper. There was also an overwhelming stench of moist carpet. I turned back around and tried to put my hand back through the wall, and it wouldn't go through. Okay, what the fuck, I muttered. I looked back into the room. There were no windows, no doors, nothing on the walls other than that disgusting wallpaper, of course. It was completely empty, aside from a singular plastic blue school chair. At this point, the only thing going through my mind was fear, and the repeating thought of, I need to leave, on loop in my head. I started running through the rooms, desperately trying to find an exit, but to no avail. There was no exit. Was this my permanent location until I died? No, there had to be a way out. I wasn't just going to be left here, right? Eventually someone would notice that I was gone. But nobody did. Then, in the distance, I heard footsteps, but not those of a human's. At least not a normal human. Alongside the footsteps was a gurgling snarl, like that of an angry animal. I began to run. I ran as fast as I could from whatever the hell was approaching me. I didn't want anything to do with it. I ran for what seemed like forever, but I was always back in the same room I started in. At least it looked like the same room. Not that I could tell them apart. So I sat down, defeated. A feeling of dread filled my body as I started to cry. I was going to die here. I'm still there. I haven't left. I've accepted my fate. In fact, I can actually hear footsteps. I wonder who that is. One school day, a boy named Tom was sitting in class and doing math. It was 6 more minutes until after school. As he was doing his homework, something caught his eye. His desk was next to the window, and he turned and looked at the grass outside. It looked like a picture. When school was over, he ran to the spot where he saw it. He ran fast so that no one else could grab it. He picked it up and smiled. It had a picture of the most beautiful girl he had ever seen. She had a dress with tights on and red shoes, and her hand was formed into a peace sign. She was so beautiful he wanted to meet her, so he ran all over school and asked everyone if they knew her or have ever seen her before. But everyone he asked said no. He was devastated. When he was home, he asked his older sister if she knew the girl, but unfortunately she also said no. It was very late, so Tom walked up the stairs, placed the picture on his bedside table, and went to sleep. In the middle of the night, Tom was awakened by a tap on his window. It was like a nail tapping. He got scared. After the tapping, he heard a giggle. He saw a shadow near his window, so he got out of his bed, walked toward his window, opened it up, and followed the giggling. By the time he reached it, it was gone. The next day again, he asked his neighbors if they knew her. Everybody said, sorry, no. When his mother came home, he even asked her if she knew her. She said no. He went to his room, placed the picture on his desk, and fell asleep. Once again, he was awakened by a tapping. He took the picture and followed the giggling. He walked across the road when suddenly he got hit by a car. He was dead with the picture in his hand. The driver got out of the car and tried to help him, but it was too late. Suddenly he saw the picture and picked it up. He saw a cute girl holding up 3 fingers. I gave her the doll on her birthday. She loved it at first and told me it was so beautiful. That its hair was so soft and the dress was so pretty. She wouldn't let it out of her sight for days. Through the daylight hours, she set it on the table so she could see it while cleaning the house, and at nighttime, it sat next to the bed, watching us sleep with big blue, unmoving eyes. But my daughter's love for the doll soon changed. Soon I noticed something was bothering her. I asked, of course, but she wouldn't tell me at first. Said she was just being silly. I could notice that day after day she became more reserved towards me until I couldn't take it anymore. I pressed her, told her she would tell me what was going on right now, or I would drag her to a doctor. She finally broke, and crying, the words came spilling out. She then told me it was the doll. It scared her. She told me she had the feeling it was constantly watching her. Sometimes it even seemed like it moved. This worried me, and I went to take a look at the doll. It sat motionless on the little table in the bedroom, the big blue eyes unchanged. I couldn't help but sigh from relief a bit. Of course she's not moving. She couldn't have been. I went to turn away, but then saw a tiny movement from the corner of my eye. I turned back to the doll. Picking it up from the table, I held my face close to the doll's, staring into the eyes. Something was moving. I tried to concentrate, tried to look closer. Yes, there it definitely was. Movement. But not from the eye itself. It was behind the eye. Before I could register this, the eye burst, and out of it spilled at least 10 wriggling maggots. I dropped the doll in shock, backing away instinctively. My daughter yelled from the other room, asking me what was going on. I yelled back at her not to worry. I picked up the doll again, using a tissue to wipe away the maggots. Inside, I saw more, pressing against the skin and plastic outer layer. So soon already. I had hoped she would have lasted longer. I'll have to get a new one for her. Maybe keep it alive at first. That way it'll last longer for sure. While I throw away the old doll, I think about how my daughter always says she loves the thick blonde curls of little Katie down the block. Doesn't she also have blue eyes? A couple of months ago, my friend's cousin, a single mother, bought a new cell phone. After a long day of work, she came home, placed her phone on the counter, and went to watch TV. Her son came to her and asked if he could play with her new phone. She told him not to call anyone or mess with text messages, and he agreed. At around 11:20, she was drowsy, so she decided to tuck her son in and go to bed. She walked to his room and saw that he wasn't there. She then ran over to her room to find him sleeping on her bed with the phone in his hand. Relieved, she picked her phone back up from his hand to inspect it. Browsing through it, she noticed only minor changes such as a new background, banner, etc. But then she opened up her saved pictures. She began deleting the pictures he had taken, until only one new picture remained. When she first saw it, she was in disbelief. It was her son sleeping on her bed, but the picture was taken by someone else above him, and it showed the left half of an elderly woman's face. A man went to a hotel and walked up to the front desk to check in. The woman at the desk gave him his key and told him that on the way to his room, there was a door with no number that was locked and no one was allowed in there. She explained that it was a storeroom and that it was out of bounds. She reminded him of this several times before allowing him upstairs, so he followed the instructions of the woman at the front desk, going straight to his room and going to bed. However, the insistence of the woman had piqued his curiosity, so the next night he walked down the hall to the door and tried the handle. Sure enough, it was locked. He bent down and looked through the wide keyhole. Cold air passed through it, chilling his eye. What he saw was a hotel bedroom, like his, and in the corner was a woman whose skin was incredibly pale. She was leaning her head against the wall, facing away from the door. He stared in confusion for a while. Was this a celebrity? The owner's daughter? He almost knocked on the door out of curiosity, but decided not to. As he was still looking, the woman turned sharply, and he jumped back from the door, hoping she would not suspect he had been spying on her. He crept away from the door and walked back to his room. The next day, he returned to the door and looked through the wide keyhole, This time all he saw was redness. He couldn't make anything out besides a distinct red color, unmoving. Perhaps the inhabitants of the room knew he was spying the night before, and had blocked the keyhole with something red. He felt embarrassed that he had made the woman so uncomfortable, and hoped she had not made a complaint with the woman at the front desk. At this point, he decided to consult her for more information. She sighed and said, "Did you look through the keyhole?" The man told her that he had, and she said, "Well, I might as well tell you the story of what happened in that room. A long time ago, a man murdered his wife in there, and we find that even now, whoever stays there gets very uncomfortable. But these people were not ordinary. They were white all over, except for their eyes, which were red." There was a hunter in the woods who, after a long day of hunting, was in the middle of an immense forest. It was getting dark, and having lost his bearings, he decided to head in one direction until he was clear of the increasingly oppressive foliage. After what seemed like hours, he came across a cabin in a small clearing. Realizing how dark it had grown, he decided to see if he could stay there for the night. He approached and found the door ajar. Nobody was inside. The hunter flopped down in the single bed, deciding to explain himself to the owner in the morning. As he looked around the inside of the cabin, he was surprised to see the walls adorned by several portraits, all painted in incredible detail. Without exception, they appeared to be staring down at him, their features twisted into the looks of hatred and malice. Staring back, he grew increasingly uncomfortable, making a concentrated effort to ignore the many hateful faces. He turned to face the wall, and exhausted, he fell into a restless sleep. The next morning, the hunter awoke. He turned, blinking in unexpected sunlight. Looking up, he discovered that the cabin had no portraits, only windows. I've been lying down for hours now. It's 5:35 a.m. and there's not much I can do. You know what the worst part about my situation is? I'm in the same room as my parents. They keep looking at me, and I can't help but look back and try not to cry or scream. Their eyes are focused on me, and their mouths are wide open. There's a strong scent of blood, and I feel paralyzed with fear. Here's the thing. The second I make any hint that I'm not asleep anymore, I'm completely fucked. I will die, and there's nobody around to save me. I've been trying to think of a way out, but the only idea I have is to rush for the front door and scream for help, hoping any neighbors hear me. It's risky, but if I stay here, I'll surely die. He's waiting for me to wake up and see his masterpiece. You're probably wondering what's going on. I do tend to get ahead of myself sometimes. About 3 hours ago, I heard screaming from the other side of the house. I got up and went to check on the noise before realizing I had to use the restroom. Instead of doing the smart thing and investigating, I used the bathroom first. I could have gotten myself killed right then for my stupid actions. I did my business and took a peek outside the bathroom. There was blood in the carpet. I got very worried and ran back to my room, hiding under the sheets like the pussy I was. I tried to convince myself to go back to sleep, that it was just some really vivid dream or something, but I heard my bedroom door open. Like the terrified child I was, I peeked out from under my blankets to see what was going on. I could see something dragging my dead parents into the room. It was not human. I can tell you that. It was hairless, with no eyes or clothing. It walked like a caveman, with its back slouched as it dragged my parents. But this thing was much smarter than any caveman. It was aware of what it was doing. It propped my dad up on the edge of the bed and made him face me. It then sat my mother down in the chair and positioned her towards me as well. It then started rubbing its hands on the walls, staining them with blood, and then drew a circle with the devil's pentagram in it. This thing had made what it would probably call a masterpiece. To finish it off, it scribbled a message into the wall that I could not read in the darkness. It then positioned itself under my bed, waiting to strike. The scariest thing now is my eyes have adjusted to the darkness since then, and I can read the message on the wall. I don't want to look at it, because it's terrifying to think about it, but I feel I need to see before I'm killed. I peek at the creature's masterpiece. I know you are awake. I was through hiking the Appalachian Trail last year when I got lost and found myself off the trail in a strange, dark hollow with heavy moss and one running stream. It was getting dark and starting to rain. I found a cave just above the creek bed, and there were no bear tracks, so I went in for shelter. Sometime in the night, a bear did come right into the cave, and I had no way out. Keeping my head, I crawled deeper into the cave and found a passage too small for the bear to fit. It led to a long crawlway, ending in a little alcove. I had no light and was terrified, but the sound of the bear in the bigger room faded away. This new room was cozy, with what felt like mounds of soft moss and crackly leaves all over the floor. A breeze blew through, and the leaves, though I couldn't see them, seemed to move all over. They tickled me all night long, making it hard to sleep. The next morning I crept back out to see if the bear was gone. He was, so I exited back into the hollow. I had a terrible rash all over my body from the itchy bedding I had slept on, and couldn't stop scratching as I gathered my stuff and went back down the creek looking for a road and some directions back to the trail. I found another trail along the creek. In a few hours, it ended at a dirt road. There I rested, trying to decide which way to walk for help. My skin was bleeding in spots now, and pustules were forming at the itchiest places. I thought I might need some cream or something. A game warden jeep came around the bend, and when the warden saw me sitting at the trailhead, he stopped. "You planning on going up there?" he asked, gesturing at the trail I had come down. "No, actually." I began, but the itching on my skin made me stop short to scratch. "Well, if you are, just stay the hell clear of Spiderness Cave." Normally you sleep soundly, but the thunderstorm raging outside is stirring you from your sleep. You begin to doze, then another crash jolts you awake. The cycle lasts most of the night. So you lay there, eyes open and outward, looking at your room stretching out before you in oblong shadows. Your eyes move from nameless object to object until you reach your mirror, sitting adjacent to you across the room. Suddenly there's a flash of lightning, and the mirror flickers in its light. For a second, the mirror reveals to you dozens of faces, silhouettes within its frame, mouths open and eyes blackened. They stare at you, their pupils fixed upon your face. Then it's done. Are you sure of what you've seen? Unsettled, you don't sleep for the rest of the evening. The next morning, you remove the mirror from your wall and toss it in the trash. It didn't matter if the vision you had seen was of the truth or falsehood. You wanted to be rid of that mirror. In fact, you scrap every mirror in your house. Weeks pass, and the event of that night falls into passive memory. You were spending the day at a friend's house and you need to use the bathroom. While you're in there, the faucet starts to run without you touching it. Taken aback by this, you do not yet act, trying to reason with your paranoia in your mind. The water starts to steam, and a skin of moisture covers the mirror up above. You're watching intently as words form. "Please return the mirrors. We miss watching you sleep at night." Hello everyone, and thanks for listening to Possessed Radio. As always, I'm your host Steven, and I want to give a quick shout out to everyone who has supported the channel and helped surpass 600 subs. I appreciate you struggling through this one with my cold, and I hope you enjoy some of the old school tales that got me into the genre. If you want to help the channel further, consider subscribing and sharing this video with someone who might enjoy, or maybe on social media. As always, the success is attributed to you all, and it's much appreciated. So thanks again for listening, take care, and as always, keep the lights off.